Alex McGrath. Hello, everyone. So, there's a girl named Dora who struggled with mental illness for about 9 years. She was a wonderful, kind soul, generous, brilliant, did well in school, was a beautiful dancer, and had the voice of an angel. She struggled with this mental illness, a very difficult one, with which doctors at the time couldn't figure out what kind. She was diagnosed with many different types, but no one was sure, so she was eventually undiagnosed. In elementary school, she skipped a grade because of her intelligence and had a pretty normal middle school experience, and started her high school career at a very prestigious private school in St. Louis called John Burroughs High School. It's a high school that's hard to get into. Her symptoms began to escalate as she started high school, having a lot of depression with tremendous emotional and mental pain. The pain began to become so difficult that she tried to commit suicide twice by overdosing on pills before graduating. She began college majoring in music, specifically for piano playing, writing songs, and singing at Hampshire College, a very prestigious college in Amherst, Massachusetts. Although she was very excited about her major and learning about what she loved, the depression and the pain she felt continued to haunt her. Her entire first year she was struggling, and from what I understand, she wasn't getting any academic accommodations or any help with anyone to talk to besides a couple of friends and perhaps a couple of compassionate staff. She was clearly exhibiting symptoms, but none of the staff there knew enough about mental illness to help her, until it became obvious after she had another suicide attempt in the form of downing a bottle of rubbing alcohol. To make a long story short, she went back home and tried to get help, but was extremely sick no matter what they had tried to help her with. So in 2008, she had enough of the pain to mean business. She went and bought a gun and completed suicide. I bring this example up not only because I can relate, but also because there's a lot of stigma in her story and not enough knowledge and compassion about mental illness or understanding for many of her teachers and professors in her schooling to help her make it through the tough times. She also had a period of a couple years before completing suicide where she was taking part in some very compromising activities, and it was viewed by many, including me, that she had changed for the worse by choice. But there was a lot of stigma that she had to deal with instead of being understood and helped by a psychiatrist and therapist. My name is Alex McGrath, and I have experienced much of the same type of victimization by way of stigma. I've had a period of about 10 years struggling with my bipolar and have come very close to ending my life. But luckily, I persevered through those moments and sought and received help when I needed it, and I believe was loved by something much bigger than me who wants me to be here. Though it is better than it used to be, bipolar is a deadly illness, much like cancer, but in the mind. This is where the stigma often represents itself. I'm extremely intelligent, a good musician, a wonderful singer, good writer, a good person, but the bipolar illness is deadly. Yet I have tools to deal with this today, including calling people in times of need. I also take my medicine, which has helped, and see a therapist and psychiatrist. Similar to the girl Dora I spoke of, I can relate to deep pain, which I have dealt with much throughout my life, especially starting my senior year of high school. I may have had the disease longer than that, but it didn't bother me too much at all in the sense that I was still highly functional. During my whole senior year, despite functionality, I was having delusions of grandeur, which lasted until a couple of years ago with manic and depressive behavior. I had a particularly tough time from 2006 to 2009, where I was still in denial of my illness and was in and out of the hospital. This past period, as it relates to today, is a good example of the stigma in college. I was not told during that time about the withdrawal process for school classes, and thus I received 9 Fs. I was essentially fighting for my life at the time, and no one from the university helped in letting us know about the withdrawal process from classes. We tried, my mother being a professor at Webster University for 27 years and retired as a professor emeritus, the highest honor a professor can get, in 2013. She went through everyone that she knew to talk to, and the bureaucracy of Webster kept leading her to different places, different people to talk to, saying that they couldn't do anything about those grades. Finally, I consulted a lawyer, and he specializes in this kind of work with stigma and mental illness and inequity in that area. And he eventually sent a letter directly to Beth Strobel, the president of Webster University. And she apparently didn't think it was important enough to respond herself. So she sent it to her provost, who said that also that they couldn't do anything about it. So yeah, and Dr. Benjamin Akande at Webster University, I took a couple of classes with him over the summer, and he seemed like a great guy, and he did a fundraiser for the Independence Center with and he was a big player in helping to raise $500,000. And I sent him an email asking, first thanking him for the stuff that he was doing, but also mentioned that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the Webster campus, but apparently they don't believe it's a priority. So sometimes I wonder, and I pretty much know, that if the same thing happened to someone with an illness of the body like cancer or a heart problem and had to leave class and be in and out of the hospital not knowing what was happening to them, like me, and got those bad grades, they probably would have changed those grades to withdrawals. So, to explain more concretely, one of the problems with stigma, possibly the biggest one, is a bit of a catch-22. What often occurs with professors and other employees of various universities is that they are aware of the illness but just don't want to deal with it, take the time needed by the student, or know how to help the student. But the real catch-22 of the stigma is that there's a prejudice against people who need accommodations. The very word accommodations implies doing favors, when it's really not about that. It's about civil rights and equity. And an illness of the mind is not considered the same. But in reality, yes, that's where we think. So there's a stigma. So it's not about accommodations. I know it's a matter of semantics, but it's really about equity and about civil rights. So, and that's part of the real catch-22 of the stigma, is that there is a prejudice against people who need accommodations. The prejudice is that if certain students need the accommodations, or really just equity, fairness, in getting equity in the sense of having to deal with something very serious that other students do not have to deal with, that's equity, that's equal rights. It's not accommodations. It's not a favor. So the prejudice is that if certain students need the accommodations, they are often thought of as less capable or not as smart as students who don't have mental illness or need accommodations. This needs to change. The other thing that needs to change is the unspoken stigma/fear that many people have towards mental illness in general. And that just because we need accommodations, that does not make us less smart or capable of having a successful career. Another problem with higher education and education in general is that it no longer requires substance or morals. All it requires is memorization and test taking, and that's a big problem in America. And that's why we need to address stigma, but also the whole education system as a whole. So, I believe that I'm here for a reason, and I believe I will be successful. And we need to talk about this stigma because it really is a civil rights issue. It's an illness of the mind, but it's just another part of the body, just the same as a heart condition. And it really is a civil rights issue. And I'm very passionate. I'm a social justice activist, and I believe that there should be equity everywhere. Everywhere. Everywhere, including school. So, that girl Dora that I spoke of at the beginning of this speech, her last name is McGrath. And if you haven't put it together, she was my sister. And I believe she had the same disease as I do. We come from the same genes. It's a deadly disease, and stigma is very relevant to this. In her suicide note, she talked about not wanting to be a burden to the family because she was aware of all of the unethical things she had done in the last year or two of her life. But if she would have seen the 1,000 people that showed up at her funeral and the thousands of people that are still grieving today, 6 years later, she would have changed her mind. If she would have gotten more support, if there wasn't as much stigma, if she learned to try to forgive herself with the help of people, being compassionate, I believe she would still be here today. So, the reason I focus on stigma is because that was the main aspect that murdered her. Yes, she went and bought the gun. She pulled the trigger. She made that choice. But that's part of the problem. That's part of this stigma. This disease led her to do things that were not in touch with her true nature, with her beauty, with her soul, with her very being. And the pain didn't stop. So, yes, she went and bought the gun. She pulled the trigger. And a lot of people say, I know what that's like, I've been there, and I've been there. I haven't done that. But no, you really haven't been there unless you actually take your life. So, bipolar, again, is a deadly disease. But many people learn over time, as I did in a long process in 10 years, that it is manageable. There is no cure. But somehow I've made it through these last 10 years and got to a point of acceptance with it, and I've forgiven myself for a lot of harms that I did during my own rough times. Her internalized stigma that stemmed from the general cultural misunderstanding of mental illness fooled her into believing that she was a horrible person and a burden on all of her family and loved ones, as opposed to realizing that it was her illness that was not being treated properly that caused her to do those things. Bipolar disease is deadly. It's cunning. And suicide has become a very noteworthy topic with how many there have been in the last couple of years, and even way longer than that. Whether famous like Robin Williams, Amy Winehouse, Heath Ledger, there are plenty more, or all the students who are dealing with various types of mental illness, and professors who are dealing with mental illness disabilities, or wonderful people like my sister who chose death over life, but whose disease, the stigma, her internalized stigma, and the disease got her to that point. So there's always hope, though. And again, if she could have seen the 1,000 people at her funeral and the thousands of people that she positively impacted, regardless of all the mistakes she made, she would still be alive today. And I think she's still with me. So, all the people, there's a very common denominator with most suicides. And as Rabbi Jim Goodman has said, they almost always commit suicide when they're alone. This is when the disease, when you really does its worst work. Stigma, again, is a huge factor. And the more we try to reduce the stigma and empower those with mental illness issues, having acceptance of your disease and getting positive reinforcement will save thousands, if not millions, of lives. Being conscious of my disease and the ups and downs, as well as the stigma, has allowed me to give myself a break on many occasions when I'm not feeling well. Yet I still have tough times. My disease likes to lie to me, especially when I'm alone. It's the common denominator. But I've learned to become stronger than the disease. I've learned to rely on something higher than me that wants me and knows the real me and wants me to keep fighting. And I call or meet with someone I trust when my bipolar and internalized stigma are trying to convince me that life is not worth living or that there is no point. Or the looks I get from teachers and faculty at times, or students who just don't get it. Some of them don't care. Some of them think they get it, but they don't. Some of them really want to get it, but it's hard. It's hard to get it unless you experience it. So I understand the people on the other side of the stigma. But it's not an excuse. It's something we need to talk about. So, realizing that this is a dark piece of writing, and the next thing I'm about to say is dark. Dora's suicide has taught me a lot. My sister may have saved my life. Yet life is not, nor will it ever be the same as when she was living. She taught me how much she impacted positively thousands of people's lives. And she taught me that suicide is not the right thing to do. I understand, but not really, as I said before, because I've never actually got to the point where I completed suicide. I'm still living. And you don't really know what it's like unless you get to that place. My life will never be the same as when she was living. Life is a darker place without her in it. But again, she saved my life because I saw the result of her illness tricking her into killing herself. My mother was devastated, along with thousands. Those people that saw, even in her worst times, her goodness and her sweetness. And she taught me that I don't want to do that to myself, to my family, and my loved ones, because I know the negative effect it has. I still struggle, but I'm doing better, and I refuse, a day at a time, to let a disease that is ruthless as well as cunning take my life. I'm working beside my illness. And so, while it is in me, sometimes I work against it. Sometimes I just let it be and do the best thing I can, next best thing, each day. So I hope, as we study and promote a better understanding of mental illness in college and elsewhere, among many other civil rights issues, we can have hope as we focus on how many good doctors, therapists, and scientists are looking for new treatments that can help people cope with them, or possibly even be cured of these diseases. In the meantime, I believe it's very important to reduce the stigma and help people get through tough moments with the knowledge that it can get better. It's one thing with bipolar or any illness, or it's the nature of life. There's difficulty, but there's also beauty and love. So it's important. It's very important to talk about the stigma and help people get through these tough moments with the knowledge that it will get better. And you will have more rough moments, but they don't last. It can get better. Stephen Hawking, Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, was 24. Around 24 when he was told that he had 2 months to live. He's now 72 years old and one of the most accomplished, smart people living. I take inspiration from him and many others who didn't think or had been told, or the stigma and the energy from people telling them that they're not going to be successful. It's bullshit. I'm going to continue to go on the ride of this life. And sometimes that means just going through the motions. And sometimes bad things happen. But sometimes great things can happen. And I'm along for the ride. And I think Dora is smiling down on me right now. And I believe she's with me right now. And in moments of doubt, my higher power, something wants me to be here. And I'll continue to be here. Rest in peace, Dora. Hang in there to everyone who's struggling from any illness, any inequity, anything, any type of discrimination. We can do this. I know if I can get through what I've been through, there are no limits to what I can do. And I believe that humanity, people are essentially good, and hatred or stigma, any kind of thing, racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice towards LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community. We can change this. And as the famous Rabbi Hillel says, if not now, then when? If not me, then who? I used to want to be a hero. I don't really want that anymore. I want there to be equity. I want there to be equality. So, to all of you who are struggling, anybody who sees this, you can get through it. It will get better. My sister told me to be strong, and sometimes being strong means opening up and acknowledging your weaknesses. That's real strength. So, I'll end on that note. Everybody, wish you the best. Even those who perpetrate hatred and stigma and don't care. Because I believe that that's their own sickness. It's a sickness. And if we don't address it, we have to. We have to address it. So, rest in peace, Dora. And hopefully this will help someone out there. Have a good night.